The biblical story of the Tower of Babel is an origin myth and parable recorded in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, meant to explain the existence of different languages and cultures. According to the story, a united human race speaking a single language migrates to Shinar in Lower Mesopotamia, where they agreed to build a great city with a tower that would reach the sky. Yahweh, observing these efforts and remarking on humanity's power in unity, confounds their speech so that they can no longer understand each other, and scatter them around the world, leaving the city unfinished. Some modern scholars have associated the Tower of Babel with known historical structures and accounts, particularly from ancient Mesopotamia. The most widely attributed inspiration is Etemenanki, a ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk in Babylon, which in Hebrew was called Babel. A similar story is also found in the ancient Sumerian legend Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, which describes events and locations in southern Mesopotamia. Etymology. The phrase, the Tower of Babel, does not appear in Genesis nor anywhere else in the Bible. It is always the city and the tower, or just the city. The original derivation of the name Babel, which is the Hebrew name for Babylon, is uncertain. The native Akkadian name of the city was Bab Ilim, meaning Gate of God. However, that form and interpretation are now usually thought to derive from Akkadian folk etymology, applied to an earlier form of the name Babila, of unknown meaning and probably non-Semitic origin. According to the narrative story of Genesis 11, the city received the name Babel from the Hebrew verb balal, meaning to jumble or to confuse, after Yahweh distorted the common language of humankind. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, this reflects wordplay due to the Hebrew terms for Babylon and to confuse having similar pronunciation. Analysis. Genre. Analysis. Genre. The Tower of Babel is a type of myth known as an etiology, which is intended to explain the origin of a custom, ritual, geographical feature, a name, or other phenomenon. Namely, the origins of the multiplicity of languages. The confusion of tongues resulting from the construction of the Tower of Babel accounts for the fragmentation of human languages. God was concerned that humans had blasphemed by building the tower to avoid a second flood, And so God brought into existence multiple languages, rendering humanity unable to understand each other. Prior to this event, humanity was stated to speak a single language, although the preceding Genesis 10:5 states that the descendants of Japheth, Gomer, and Javan dispersed with their own tongues. Augustine of Hippo explained this apparent contradiction by arguing that the story, without mentioning it, goes back to tell how it came about that the one language common to all men was broken up into many tongues. Modern scholars has traditionally held that the two chapters were written by different sources, the former by the priestly source and the latter by the Yahwist. However, that theory has been debated among scholars in recent years. Themes. The story's theme of competition between God and humans appears elsewhere in Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The first century Jewish interpretation, found in Flavius Josephus, explains the construction of the tower as a hubristic act of defiance against God, ordered by the arrogant tyrant Nimrod. There have been some contemporary challenges to this classical interpretation, with emphasis placed on the explicit motive of cultural and linguistic homogeneity mentioned in the narrative 11:1, 4, and 6. This reading of the text sees God's action not as punishment for pride, but as an etiology of cultural differences, presenting Babel as the cradle of civilization. Genesis 11:8 reports that the construction of the tower was incomplete when its builders were dispersed around the world. Verse 11, however, has the Lord visiting the tower which the children of man had built. Kale and Delitzsch suggest that the tower was therefore finished up to a certain point at this stage. Height. The book of Genesis does not specify the tower's height. The phrase, "its top in the sky," 11:4, was an idiom for impressive height rather than implying arrogance. The book of Jubilees, 10:21, mentions the tower's height as being 5,433 cubits and 2 palms. That would be 2,484 meters, or 8,150 feet, or about 1.54 miles. Or in other measurements, about 3 times the height of Burj Khalifa. The The apocryphal Third Apocalypse of Baruch mentions that the Tower of Strife reached a height of 463 cubits, which is 211.8 meters, or 695 feet. Taller than any structure built in human history until the construction of the Eiffel Tower in 1889, which was 324 meters, or 1,060 feet in height. Gregory of Tours, writing in the year 594, quotes the earlier historian Orosius from the year 417 as saying the tower was laid out foursquare on a very level plain. Its wall, made of baked brick cemented with pitch, is 50 cubits in width by 200 cubits in length, and 470 states in circumference. That would be about 82.72 kilometers, or 51.4 miles. A stade was an ancient Greek unit of length, based on the circumference of a typical sports stadium at the time, which was about 176 meters, or 577 feet. The description continues. 25 gates are situated on each side, which make in all 100. The doors of these gates, which are of wonderful size, are cast in bronze. The same historian tells many other tales of the city and says, although such was the glory of its building, still it was conquered and destroyed. A typical medieval account is given by Giovanni Villani in the year 1300. He relates that it measures 8 miles, or 130 kilometers, round, and it was already 4,000 paces high and 1,000 paces thick, and each pace is 3 of our feet. The 14th century traveler John Mandeville also included an account of the tower and reported that its height had been 64 furlongs, according to the local inhabitants. The 17th century historian Verstegen provides yet another figure. Quoting Isidore, he says that the tower was 5,164 paces high, and quoting Josephus and the tower, that the tower was wider than it was high, more like a mountain than a tower. He also quotes unnamed authors who say that the spiral path was so wide that it contained lodgings for workers and animals, and other authors who claim that the path was wide enough to have fields for growing grain for the animals used in the construction. In his book, Structures or Why Things Don't Fall Down, J.E. Gordon considers the height of the Tower of Babel. He wrote, "Brick and stone weighed about 120 per cubic foot. 120 pounds per cubic foot, or 2,000 kilograms per cubic meter. And the crushing strength of these materials is generally rather better than 6,000 pounds per square inch, or 400 megapascals. Elementary arithmetic shows that a tower with parallel walls could have been built to a height of 2.1 kilometers, or 1.3 miles, before the bricks at the bottom were crushed. However, by making the walls taper towards the top, they could well have been built to a height where the men of Shinar would run short of oxygen and had difficulty in breathing before the brick walls crushed beneath their own dead weight." Composition. Authorship. Jewish and Christian tradition attributes the composition of the whole Pentateuch, which includes the story of the Tower of Babel, to Moses. Modern biblical scholarship rejects Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, but is divided on the question of its authorship. Many scholars subscribe to some form of the documentary hypothesis, which argues that the Pentateuch is composed of multiple sources that were later merged. Scholars who favor this hypothesis, such as Richard Elliott Friedman, tend to see Genesis 11:1-9 as being composed by the J or Yahwist source. Michael Coogan suggests that the intentional wordplay regarding the city of Babel and the noise of the people's babbling is found in the Hebrew words as easily as in English, is considered typical of the Yahwist source. John Van Seters, who has put forth substantial modifications to the hypothesis, suggests that these verses are part of what he calls a pre-Yahwist stage. Other scholars reject the documentary hypothesis altogether. The minimalist scholars tend to see the book of Genesis through 2 Kings as written by a single anonymous author during the Hellenistic period. Historicity. Biblical scholars see the book of Genesis as mythological and not as an historical account of events. Genesis is described as beginning with a historicized myth and ending with a mysticized history. Nevertheless, the story of Babel can be interpreted in terms of its context. Elsewhere in Genesis, it is stated that Babel formed part of Nimrod's kingdom, which is located in Lower Mesopotamia. The Bible does not specifically mention that Nimrod ordered the building of the tower, but many other sources have associated its construction with him. Genesis 11:9 attributes the Hebrew version of the name Babel to the verb balal, which means to confuse or to confound in Hebrew. The 1st century Roman Jewish author Flavius Josephus similarly explained that the name was derived from the Hebrew word Babel, meaning confusion. Possible origins. Etemenaki. Etemenaki in Sumerian, meaning Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, was the name of a ziggurat dedicated to Marduk in the city of Babylon. It was famously rebuilt in the 6th century BCE Neo-Babylonian rulers Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II, but had fallen into disrepair by the time of Alexander the Great's conquest. He managed to move the tiles of the tower to another location, but his death stopped the reconstruction, and it was demolished during the reign of his successor, Antiochus Soter. Greek historian Herodotus wrote an account of the ziggurat in his histories, which he called the Temple of Zeus Belus. According to modern scholars, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel was likely influenced by Etemenaki. Stephen L. Harris proposed this occurred during the Babylonian captivity. Isaac Asimov speculated that the author of Genesis 11:1-9 were inspired by the existence of an apparent incomplete ziggurat at Babylon, and by the phonological similarity between Babylonian Bab-Ilu, meaning Gate of God, and the Hebrew word Balal, meaning mixed, confused, or confounded. Mesopotamian analogues. There are similar stories to the Tower of Babel in the Sumerian myth Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. Enmerkar of Uruk is building a massive ziggurat in Eridu and demands a tribute of precious materials from Aratta for its construction. At one point, reciting an incantation imploring the god of Enki to restore, or in Kramer's translation, to disrupt, the linguistic unity of the inhabited regions. Named as Zubur, Hamasi, Sumer, Uriki or Akkad, and the Martu land. The whole universe, well guarded people, may they all address Enlil together in a single language. The Eridu Genesis, an ancient Sumerian flood myth, included a passage about the unity of human speech before the gods intervened. During the Neo-Assyrian period, a fragmentary text found in Nineveh from the library of Ashurbanipal, which contains part of the Eridu Genesis, along with a general interest Ashurbanipal's library had in preserving older traditions, suggest that these stories of language, confusion, and divine intervention were still relevant during this period. This is further evidence that the Neo-Assyrian divine punishment motif often found in royal inscriptions, which described the gods punishing nations for their arrogance, particularly through destruction, scattering, or confusion, a theme seen in the Tower of Babel story. In the annals of the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib, year 705 to 681 BCE, he described how the gods confused the plans of his enemies and scattered their forces, resulting in his victory and the destruction of Babylon in the year 689 BCE. These events may have influenced later biblical writers during the period of Babylonian captivity, who viewed the city's fall as a divine act, reinforcing the idea that Babylon's pride led to its downfall.